Good afternoon, folks. This is John Rust on The John Rust Show. Rust on the radio here on Freedom 95, 950 AM and 95.9 FM, broadcasting all across central Indiana, a beacon for the truth and freedom for all Hoosiers. Welcome to the show, folks. I'm here in the studio with Mike Wilson. Hi, Mike.
Hello, John.
Had
Thanks for having me back again. Oh, I've had a very good week.
Okay, very good. And Justin George.
Great to be here, and I've had a great week as well.
Fantastic. So I am your friend and farmer from Seymour, Indiana, home of John Cougar Mellencamp and my family's egg farm, Roseacre Farms. I have good news on that. Egg prices are dropping rapidly. We are getting our farm in Jackson County, which was devastated by bird flu just a few months ago. It is now 1 quarter full already. We are filling back as fast as we can with new pullets who are starting to lay eggs. The egg supply is coming back up, and so the price is dropping as a result. I was just at the Walmart here in Franklin, and eggs were $2.98 a dozen. So good news on that front. But unfortunately, folks, there's some really bad news. Our nation's debt is continuing to explode, and it's hard to fathom how much this debt is, but I'm going to try to explain it a little bit differently today. 1 million seconds ago was 11 days ago. 1 billion seconds, billion with a B, seconds ago was 1993. 1 trillion seconds ago was 30,000 BC, over 30,000 years ago. To put that in perspective, the U.S. national debt is now rising by $1 trillion, with a T, trillion dollars, every 180 days. This is exploding. And what is happening in Washington, our political leaders that are forced on us are doing nothing. They just keep not just kicking the can down the road, they are bankrupting our children. And huge news this week on that. Elon Musk came out and said, and I'm going to read his exact tweet on this. This is from Elon Musk. He says, "I'm sorry, I just can't stand it anymore. This massive, outrageous, pork-filled congressional spending bill is a disgusting abomination. Shame on those who voted for it. You know you did wrong. You know it." Every member of the Indiana Republican congressional delegation voted for that bill. Shame on them. We're supposed to be conservatives in Indiana. Indiana is a red state. We should not be passing the buck to our children to pay for what we are using today. And that's exactly what they are doing. That is theft. That is outright theft. And it is absolutely appalling to me that Congress passed that. Hopefully the Senate will stop that, but, fat chance of that. Look what just happened over the minuscule $9 billion in cuts that Trump sent in for the Congress to codify. Congress passed the buck on that again. So, folks, where we're at, just to put this in perspective, Elon Musk's DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, has identified and saved over $504 billion, with a B, billion dollars in savings in just these last 4 months. He was on track, in my opinion, to save $2 trillion in massive government waste. He was finding it. But what was happening was, behind the scenes, congressional Republicans were saying, no, we don't want that. We really enjoy these earmarks and spending all this money for ourselves. So they're making a big show out of cutting $9 billion out of that. You know what $9 billion out of $500 billion that Elon Musk identified in savings percentage-wise is? That's less than 2%. It's 0.018%. Not even 2% of the amount of money that Elon Musk has saved the United States will be codified by Congress. And they didn't even do that. What they did this past week, they said, well, no more votes. We were going to vote on it. Let's not. Let's take another day off. So they're not even voting for it. The House just canceled all votes for Friday, which means they've will have a 2.5 day work week with 0 Doge cuts. That's from Nick Sorter. He says the House GOP is worthless. Amen to that. Why on earth can't they even do that minuscule 2% this week? They ran home. They're not even going home. I don't know where they're going. They just got off a 12-day vacation, and they cannot work a Friday to codify the Doge cuts. What on earth is going on? But back to Elon Musk. Interest payments already consume 25% of all government revenue. That is a direct quote from Elon Musk. If the massive deficit spending continues, there will only be money for interest payments and nothing else. No Social Security, no medical, no defense, nothing. And what's going on in Washington to save us from this? Jim Banks, Todd Young, Aaron Houchin, the entire GOP delegation are bankrupting America for your kids. The House of Representatives just passed a bill that is on target to increase the national debt by $20 trillion. That is inexcusable. $20 trillion. That's this amount of money. You can't even fathom how much that is. They refuse to enact the Doge cuts. If Elon Musk was given free rein to cut spending how he wanted to, we would be in a budget surplus this year. There would be absolutely no reason to even increase the debt ceiling. Instead, Congress, they just are, I hate using that term, kicking the can down the road, because it's so lackadaisical. It's not. They are kicking your kids in the head. That's what they're doing by having this massive debt. They are destroying the value of the dollar by continuing to increase our national spending for all this crazy stuff. The $50 million for condoms for Gaza. Why isn't that being codified as a cut? Instead, Congress is saying, no, that's fine. So 100 Hoosiers, a Hoosier taxpayer, by the way, on average, pays in federal taxes over $500,000 in federal taxes during their lifetime. That means 100 Hoosiers are going to have to work their entire lives, thanks to our Indiana GOP, thanks to Todd Young, Jim Banks, Aaron Houchin, the entire GOP delegation, refusing to cut that $50 million as a Doge cut. They've not done it. They need to do that. It is completely, what's the word, heartless to say, hey, Hoosier taxpayer, you've got to work your entire life to pay for condoms for Gaza? Over 100? That's not right. Elon Musk says this spending bill contains the largest debt increase in U.S. history. He calls it the debt slavery bill. If you look at what Rand Paul has to say about this, he says, while I oppose increasing the debt ceiling by $5 trillion, I enthusiastically support making the tax cuts permanent and could vote for the big, not yet beautiful bill if the debt ceiling were voted on separately. They just passed the no taxes on tips, and it passed unanimously. I believe in both the House and the Senate. Were there any no votes on that? I don't believe so. So don't tell me that you can't do this while having all this massive debt. And they're using it as an excuse. They're saying, well, you're not going to get these tax cuts extended, because they're really not tax cuts. They're just extending the present tax rates we have today, which we're going to automatically go up. So it's not like you're going to be paying less taxes. They're just saying, okay, we're going to keep the tax rates where they are. Yeah, I'll tell you the real reason they didn't make those tax cuts permanent. They want to have a gun to your head and say, if you don't vote for us, we won't extend those tax cuts in the future. So they say, okay, every 5 years or every 6 years, you're going to have to vote for those tax cuts to be extended again and again. That's the real reason. And that's just wrong. That's something career politicians do. That's absolutely wrong. Back to this national debt. Listen to this. 10% of the national debt in one bill our government is out of control. That's how much the debt that they are working to pass this year increases. 10% of the entire national debt. And that's from 1776 to today, for over 249 years. What on earth is going on? Why can't Congress just simply enact the Doge cuts? It's not difficult if you don't want to really do it. That's the key there, folks. They really don't want to do it. Again, Doge has found $504 billion in tax cuts. You know, per taxpayer, that's $4,495 of savings for you as a taxpayer this year that Congress is just saying, nope, you don't get that cut. You're going to have that added to your kids' debt anyhow. When we come back, folks, we're going to get right back into this. This is John Rust on the John Rust Show on Freedom 95. Welcome back, folks. This is John Rust on the John Rust Show. Rust on the radio on Freedom 95, 950 AM and 95.9 FM on your radio dial all across central Indiana. The choice for freedom-loving Hoosiers all across our state. So, in other news this week, there's so much to get onto. Jim Banks' pal, Lindsey Grahamnesty, is in the news again. And I use that name. You all remember that name, Lindsey Grahamnesty. That was Rush Limbaugh's name for Lindsey Graham. He was the one that was pushing amnesty, and you know that's what Jim Banks and all these, his pal is really pushing in his heart. You know, where he's calling for an influx of immigrants. Remember that. Jim Banks, Mr. Influx of Immigrants. He certainly got his wish. Anyhow, Senator Lindsey Grahamnesty and Senators Richard Blumenthal traveled to Kyiv, Ukraine this last week. On June 1st, 2025, two staggering transactions surfaced. One for a mind-blowing $403,000 and another for an eye-popping $411,000. These were apparently and allegedly just for hotel bills. How on earth do you pay $400,000 for a hotel bill anywhere, let alone Ukraine? I can't imagine. You know, what service you get there. I don't know if Jim Banks was along for that ride or not, what they were doing in that room, but good grief.
Is that part of the State Department budget, John?
Well, this is the bad part on it. Senator Lindsey Grahamnesty is chairman of the committee that approves the travel expenses, so he could approve his own $400,000, apparently, hotel room. You know, talk about government extravagance. I just don't see how you spend $400,000 for a hotel room. I get miffed when it's over $150 for a hotel room if you stay at a Hampton Inn somewhere anymore. You know, that's $400,000. Oh, my gosh.
What kind of a hotel room is that?
Well, that's our Republican Senate at quote-unquote work. You know, they don't show up, but boy, they sure love their luxury travel on your dime. And not just on your dime, on your kids' dime. All this debt, you know, $400,000 hotel rooms, you know, to put that in perspective, remember I just said in the first segment, a Hoosier taxpayer pays $500,000 in federal taxes on average in their lifetime. That means one Hoosier had to work 80% of their entire lives just to pay for the hotel room for however many nights Lindsey Grahamnesty was in that hotel. Almost an entire life of work to pay for that hotel room. It's appalling. It's repulsive. It's why I can't stand these people, these leeches. You know, Washington is nothing but a swamp of leeches, rats, and snakes.
And they're all creatures of it.
And that's, unfortunately, that's insulting to rats and snakes, because rats and snakes are actually honorable creatures. They're honest about their lives and, you know, going about their work in the food chain. But these politicians, they just are slithering around with each other, spending money on your dime, and then chalking it up to debt for your kids to pay. Back on these Doge cuts, what's happening now, Mike? Did you see this?
Well, what's that, John?
Many Republican members of Congress are now privately saying they prefer to wait until after the 2026 midterms to codify President Trump's Doge cuts.
And why would they say that?
Because they're never, ever, never going to pass them. We are just, we're only, 6 months into this Congress, and they're already saying, the Republicans, not Democrats, the Republicans are already saying, let's wait until after the next midterms before we do any cutting. It's just incredulous to me how bad these career politicians are. And that includes every single member of the Indiana GOP House delegation that voted for that bill. There is no excuse to be voting for $20 trillion in new projected debt to add that to our children's future. There is no excuse for that. Elon Musk has endorsed a proposal to bar all sitting members of Congress from re-election if the deficit exceeds 3% of the United States gross domestic product. Amen. We need term limits. We absolutely need term limits. Some people say 2 terms in the House and maybe 1 term in the Senate. I don't know what the current thinking is, but there has to be something to get rid of these people because they are not interested in working for you. So on Elon Musk, God bless him. If you recall, in last week's show, we talked about where he said he, quote unquote, did my best. He was so disheartened. He's worked his heart out. He was sleeping on the floor in the office building across from the White House for months on end to make all these massive cuts in government waste. This wasn't, cutting at meat projects that we need. This was waste, where he identified millions of fake senior Social Security numbers in the Social Security registry. All this money was going out. And there was no accountability in Washington. Our House and Senate, they just go on vacation. But, this is from Matt Van Swall talking about Elon Musk. He has now been shunned by Democrats, demonized by liberals. Look at how much pain he has endured for the Tesla brand from all the graffiti and vandalization that's been going on people that drive Tesla automobiles. And Congress is just letting him out to dry. They don't care. They don't give a rat's caboose about it. They don't care. But Elon Musk tried to save America anyway, even though he knew it would damage his brands and damage him financially. Look how much money he gave to help elect President Trump and the Republicans in Congress, and they screw him over like this. And Doge is massively popular. Massively. Doge is literally, this is from Matt Van Swall again, Doge is literally one of the most popular government initiatives in history. 73% of Americans say they support cutting government waste. 73%. Trump brought in the smartest man on earth to do it. This is from Matt Van Swall. The left destroyed Elon for doing it. And the GOP won't even vote on it. And they won't even vote for 2% of it this week. They kicked that down the road till next week. They're all saying, oh, yeah, we're going to. Jim Banks is out there tweeting, oh, yeah, we're going to do the 2%. What hogwash. These people are absolute criminals. They only are interested in massive government spending and not doing their jobs and not showing up for work.
Shame on all of them, especially Senator Banks.
Well, look, his new best friend in the Senate is Elizabeth Warren. You saw where they're working together to go after the fire truck manufacturers. Jim Banks' pal, Elizabeth Warren, says, good riddance to Elon Musk. But Musk isn't off the hook for his chaos and corruption. We must hold him accountable. So apparently Elizabeth Warren is going to be calling up Elon Musk to testify about this someday if the Democrats regain the Senate majority. And I think that's the plan for them Republicans all along. They really want Trump to be investigated. They all pretend to be for Trump.
It's all a show.
No, the only thing they care about is their own careers. Absolutely, positively, nothing else. Nothing else. Nothing else. That's why they say one thing in Indiana at Lincoln Day dinners and vote exactly the opposite in D.C. This is from RollingStone.com, exclusive. Elon Musk's reign of corruption chronicled in Elizabeth Warren report. A new report by Senator Elizabeth Warren itemizes 130 dodgy dealings by the man who calls himself the Doge Father. No. They are coming after Elon, and, who is Jim Banks palling around with? That's Elizabeth Warren. This tells you where they are really, where their hearts really are. They do not believe in covering, they want to prosecute the people that are identifying government waste. Not the people that are actually spending it, but the people that are identifying it. The Doge team. Elizabeth Warren, she's all but said they're going to have hearings on this someday. And they're going to call Elon Musk up there and testify, say, hey, why were you trying to save taxpayers' money? They won't shield it that way, but that's what they really feel. They really feel, these senators, all of them, irregardless of party, it's the uniparty, they feel it's their God-given right to spend and spend and spend with no accountability to anyone. No accountability. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis slammed the Republican Party for abandoning Elon Musk and his Doge efforts as he declared the swamp has won. The former presidential hopeful, this is from the ukmail.com, the former presidential hopeful torched the GOP after House Republicans approved a bill which significantly raises the U.S. national debt and increases spending. Musk spoke out this week to condemn the bill for undermining the work he put in at Doge to cut government waste, saying his cost-cutting team is being treated like whipping boys as their moves would be essentially canceled out by the bill. DeSantis quickly took Musk's side on the falling out with Trump, saying on X that the world's richest man was hit with attacks on his company as well as personal matters to lead the efforts on Doge. And Congress has just swiped that all aside and say, well, no, we're going to keep continuing funding things like U.S. aid. It is a direct betrayal of the voters who elected them. Folks, when we come back, we'll get right back into this. This is John Rust on The John Rust Show on Freedom 95. Welcome back, folks. This is John Rust on The John Rust Show on Freedom 95, 95.9 FM, 950 AM, broadcasting all across central Indiana for all freedom-loving Hoosiers, for all conservative Hoosiers, for all Hoosiers who believe that we have to balance our checkbooks. Congress doesn't, but you and I have to. Well, the fact that the GOP did not vote on a single Doge cut while Elon was a special government employee will go down as the worst political blunder in the history of Congress. This is again from Matt Van Swall. He says, it's so insane it's almost hard to believe. Elon Musk says, this is his quote, as my scheduled time as a special government employee comes to an end, I would like to thank President @real Donald Trump for the opportunity to reduce wasteful spending. The Doge mission will only strengthen over time as it becomes a way of life throughout the government. That was on May 28th. Unfortunately, that wasn't to be. Congressional Republicans, they're not afraid of Democrats. You know why? They are Democrats. They're the uniparty. They love their donor money, the trappings of their office, the power big government gives them. It's why they smear guys like Thomas Massey and Chip Roy who aren't into those things. Pure and simple. That's from John Cordillo on X.
And he's correct.
And what is happening is these GOP congressmen, they're all, they're out basically saying thoughts and prayers for Elon Musk and Doge. They all had 130 days to vote on Doge cuts. None of them pushed hard enough to get it done. They didn't do any of it. All they did was rename the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America, which is wonderful. But, let's do something substantive. Congress, they're all about renaming post office, and that's about it.
It's a big, beautiful accomplishment like they probably think it is.
Well, wait. Yeah, there'll be another show on the road on renaming stuff that Carlin the Charlatan Yodeler, he really loved to rename stuff in Indiana.
And I might just also point out he wrote a resolution praising President Barack Obama in 2008.
Well,
probably because he wanted to switch parties.
They're all uniparty. It's all one. If you're a career politician, all you care about is your own career. You don't care about America. You certainly don't care about America's future or America's kids, because they're going to have to pay for this. This massive debt that they all just voted for. Senator Ron Johnson rips Trump's big, beautiful bill. I couldn't care less if he's upset. I'm concerned about my children and grandchildren. $37 trillion in debt, and we're going to add to it. There is no way I'm going to vote for this bill in its current form. That is from Ron Johnson. But you have to remember, folks, President Trump, it's very important, he texted out and called for a balanced budget now. His exact text was, balanced budget now. Let's give it a shot. Lots of money coming in from tariffs. Do it. DJT, Donald J. Trump. And that was before all the massive Doge cuts. We were on a glide path to $2 trillion, with a T, trillion dollars in savings thanks to Elon Musk. We got up to $500 billion in savings, and Congress is now talking about maybe doing $9 billion with a B, which is less than 0.018% of what Elon Musk has found. It's pathetic. I like this quote from Senator Ron Johnson. I think us oldsters have stolen enough from younger generations. He was being interviewed by Tucker Carlson. Tucker says, it's disgusting. Yes, it absolutely is disgusting. So many seniors are worried about Social Security reform, but if we don't get our nation's finances in order, my generation will have nothing. And he's talking about himself there. That's Tucker. Because he knows that what Congress is doing is bankrupting the United States. You can't add $20 trillion to the already $37 trillion debt. When Jim Banks and Todd Young were sworn into Congress in 2018, your share of the national debt, 2017. In 2017, your share of the national debt was $170,000 per taxpayer in the United States. Today, it's over $323,000. And they're actually fudging the numbers right now. It's going to be jumping this fall once they start booking the debt that's been accumulating over the summer again. Your debt is projected now to go over $500,000 per taxpayer. That means you, in addition to what you're going to be paying your lifetime, you're going to have $500,000 in federal debt tacked onto that your kids are going to have to pay. And there's no such thing as a free lunch. How that will come out is massive inflation. That's why we have the inflation today.
They're changing the math.
Nothing's for free.
Well, and it's like the pennies. Congress just passed a law, stopping production of the U.S. penny because they're pointless anymore. They have devalued American currency to the point where United States penny costs 4 cents to make, and that they are not made of copper. They're made of zinc, copper plated. So the metallic cost is nothing in that. What costs it, is the labor and shipping and all that. All that is 4 cents per penny. So of course it's crazy to make a penny anymore. And why is that? Because of inflation, because of the national debt. We have to have a tax bill that will actually reduce the deficit, and they refuse to do that. Congress claims if you do the math right, quote unquote, it does that, but that's all baloney. And I'm using the polite term. Maybe I could use a farm term, bull crap. But
Sounds about right. You can use it.
I'd use a little bit stronger one. But what our Congress is doing, it is inexplicable. It's disgusting. It's not inexplicable. It's unfortunately the sad reality based on who we have as our elected representatives. All of them. Remember, every single member of the Indiana House GOP voted for that awful abomination of a bill. Elon Musk is calling for a new bill. He says, let's scrap that and start over. Speaker Johnson said, oh no, we worked 130 days on that. That's baloney. Congress has hardly even shown up for the job this year. Look how few of days they actually showed up, and, we're in their show on Saturday. But just yesterday, Congress was supposed to vote on the Doge cuts, and they canceled it because they'd rather go on vacation again after they just took a 2-week vacation. When on earth does Congress ever work?
Almost never.
Well, back to the good old days. This is in 1978. A student earning minimum wage during the summer could afford to pay a full year's in-state tuition at a 4-year public university without going into debt. That's very true. I worked my way through Indiana University from 1985 to 1990, and you could absolutely pay, I didn't have any debt whatsoever because I worked. I worked full-time at Roseacres all the way through, so I was working, I took 5 years, but I was working the whole time. That's, what a lot of Hoosiers have to do. Back then it was a different world. Today, everyone's like, oh, let's just get some student loans because they're going to be forgiven. Well, when that money's forgiven, someone's paying for that. The person that's out welding is paying for it. The person that's fixing your plumbing's paying for it. The grocery checkout clerk is paying for it. There is no such thing as a free lunch. There's no such thing as debt forgiveness. Someone is paying for that. Someone that is working is paying for that, or someone that is working's kids will be paying for that. We have to have real conservatives again. Again, Indiana is a red state. We are a ruby red state. And I noticed Todd Young starting to take my talking points on this show, so I guess, Todd, you're listening. Welcome to the show. Because he's talking about Indiana being a red state. Well, thank you for listening, Todd. Yes, Indiana is a red state, but it means more than just talking about it. I'm going to call you guys out when you go to a Lincoln Day dinner and you thump your chest about how conservative you are. Well, you can't go to Washington and then vote to increase the national debt under any circumstance. Maybe if we're at war, but, we're not at war. This is just crazy. It is inexcusable, and it's lazy. It is lazy because the Senate's only in session, on average 2.5 days a week at that. Plus they take weeks off at a time for vacation. I will tip my hat one thing to Todd Young. At least he lives in Indiana.
That's true. And we got another guy. His other colleague lives in Springfield, Virginia.
Well, Indiana has one senator, Todd Young. Virginia has 3 senators, Jim Banks and whoever the other 2 are.
Mark Warner and Tim Kaine.
That's right.
And Jim Banks. But Indiana voters had to have him forced on us to represent us, unfortunately. But that's another story. We'll get into that in another show again, and we'll talk about how 81% of Hoosiers are banned from running for political office. But we'll be having a show on that very soon.
I have a lot to say on that, by the way.
Well, Congress, they just have to get to work. I'm a farmer. If a farmer had the work ethic of these congressmen and senators, you would be bankrupt because, they're obviously bankrupting the nation. You couldn't survive as a farmer working like Jim Banks, Todd Young, and our House delegation could. There's no way you could survive. But you can survive when you're making your kids pay for it. Someone else is paying for it. Free lunch is a great thing today if you're just going to make future generations pay for it.
Saddling us with that.
But that is just wrong. Absolutely wrong. So, folks, when we come back, we'll get right back into this. This is John Rust on Freedom 95, 950 AM and 95.9 FM, broadcasting all across central Indiana for all freedom-loving Hoosiers. This is John Rust. We'll be right back. Welcome back, folks. This is John Rust on The John Rust Show on Freedom 95, broadcasting across central Indiana on 950 AM and 95.9 FM for freedom-loving Hoosiers all across the Hoosier State. Welcome back. Joined in the studio with Mike Wilson, Aiden Marietta joining us.
Thank you.
And Justin George.
Great to be here.
So in Indiana news this past week, this is going to be a huge, massive issue. Here we go. We cannot have a moratorium on the death penalty in Indiana, but that's what the Indiana GOP is now pushing. No. So what's happened, folks? Mike Braun is saying he's not going to be ordering any more lethal injection medicine because it costs $400,000 per dose. And it has a shelf life. And so, that's very expensive. I understand that. So I think there's a simple solution to this.
Yeah, John, didn't you mention the firing squad?
Yes.
You're a pro gun.
Well, I am very pro death penalty. The Bible says, go to the Old Testament, Leviticus, chapter 24, verses 17 through 22. It's an eye for an eye, a life for a life. We have to have real meaningful consequences for crime. Unfortunately, the Indiana GOP does not feel that way. And, I think some of them are going to speak up and say no, but you have, look at people like Todd Young and Jim Banks who voted for the First Step Act, which forgives, fentanyl dealers for their crimes and lets them out of prison early. No way. This is what pisses me off about them. They come here and they speak how evil fentanyl is. And Jim Banks and Todd Young voted for the bill that lets fentanyl dealers out of prison early.
It's disgusting. And I just have to say, as a young conservative, the fact that these people, they say one thing and they do another. They don't value human life. They don't value human life.
Oh, and you should see their ads on fentanyl. And, it's the most evil thing, and it's coming across the border, and we're going to stop it. But then they go and allow fentanyl dealers out of prison early. How many Hoosiers have died because of that? How many Hoosiers will die because of that? How many Americans have died because of that?
Innocent lives that cannot be brought back.
Well, if you do the crime, you have to do the time. Period. We cannot be soft on these criminals. And it gets back to the death penalty. Guess what, folks? It may be $400,000 for a lethal injection. That is crazy. I'd say, no, don't pay that. Bring back the firing squad. A bullet's $1 or less. Huge savings. So, folks, we just saved $399,000 per execution right here on this show.
Yes. Something I think that's also important is the First Step Act actually oversteps our authority and actually killed the state's 3 strikes law, which was enacted in the 1990s. And that's important because, remember, the 1990s had a lot of crime. States like California, under Governor Pete Wilson, a conservative Republican, actually put in a law that said for repeat offenders, 3 strikes and you're out. Indiana did the same thing in the 90s. And my feeling is that we need to say, no, we don't care what the First Step Act says. 3 strikes and you're out. If we're not enforcing that law, we need to bring it back and strengthen it if we need to.
Again, we have all these GOP senators from Indiana, and they say one thing here in the state, and they vote exactly the opposite in Washington, D.C., folks. And so, folks, if you're driving by or listening to this on your radio in your house, you're thinking, well, that's crazy. These guys are so conservative, they would never do that. But no.
Oh, they would.
Absolutely, unfortunately, our elected GOP congressmen and senators, in the case of Jim Banks and Todd Young, voted for the First Step Act, which absolutely releases fentanyl dealers from prison early based on certain guidelines. And that totally violates the concept of 3 strikes and you're out. If you there's just no recovering from that. I'm sorry. Fentanyl is a bad, bad drug. This isn't, something to be taken lightly. And they're off letting them out scot-free. But back on this moratorium. So Governor Braun, absolutely, we have to keep the death penalty in Indiana. Let's not have a moratorium. Hoosiers, again, this is a red state. This is a conservative state. We believe if you do the crime, you have to do the time. Plain and simple. It's not complicated. In other news on Indiana this week, this is Mike Braun was tweeting about this. Hoosiers need public utilities to take a fresh look at our options with a focus on reliability and affordability, not ESG goals. Unfortunately, the GOP in the state of Indiana has been forcing ESG and all this other DEI crap on our utilities and wind energy and the Green New Deal and these solar panels on the toll roads up on I-90. Good grief. We don't need all this expensive energy forced on us when there is an obvious alternative. And it's not, a lot of people talk about nuclear power. Yeah, that's great. But I would caution on that. Watch the movie Chernobyl. It's on Amazon Prime. I highly recommend it. It is a great miniseries. And it shows you exactly what happens when the state runs a nuclear reactor. And it's just, the crew that was responsible for the Chernobyl nuclear accident in 1986. If you watch that, there are so many similarities between that and how our elected officials are acting here in Indiana. It's the same thing. They only care about their careers, not about what is actually going on in the state of Indiana. The number one thing for Hoosiers right now is we need inexpensive electricity, and we have that with coal. There's nothing wrong with coal. There is nothing wrong with carbon. I've done whole shows on this, and we'll be doing another show on this in the future, where carbon is not bad. Human beings breathe out 2 pounds of carbon per day.
And the trees love it.
But the Indiana GOP, unfortunately, has bought into this thing that carbon is bad, and they want to talk about carbon sequestration. Erin Houchin, she was worried that the big, beautiful bill, quote unquote, which Elon Musk correctly terms an abomination, keeps funding for carbon sequestration. That's absolutely hogwash. We do not need that. We need to have clean coal burning clean energy for the state of Indiana inexpensively. China is still building today 2 new coal-powered power plants every single week. And they have no plans on stopping that.
They're going to keep going.
So Indiana, we should absolutely be building new coal-powered plants. We shouldn't be shutting them down. There are 2 coal-powered plants right now in southwestern Indiana that they are shutting down early, folks, before their service life is out, to meet carbon goals imposed, I guess, by the state of Indiana. I don't know who's doing that, but it is crazy. Why on earth would we be shutting down a coal-powered plant in the state of Indiana that still has years of service life on it?
And it costs a lot of money to shut it down early, too.
Well, I was talking about this with Ethan Hatcher, and he was bringing this up. Coal-powered plants today are not what people think of when you think of coal-powered plants. All you see is harmless water vapor emitting from the stacks. They are not belching smoke whatsoever. They are very, very, very clean. Clean coal is not a misnomer. Instead, we are getting all this wind and solar energy pushed on us, and that is very expensive. So this is from WRTV Indianapolis. AES Indiana, that's a utility here, seeks a rate review that may lead to higher electric rates. If approved, customers will see a 7.5% increase in the second quarter of 2026 and another 6% increase in January of 2027. So this guy named the Hunter on X says, so I guess these miles and miles of solar fields are having no effect on our electric bills except to increase them? ? Yes, absolutely. Green energy is extremely expensive. Green energy is extremely unreliable. We have to keep our coal plants going. No, folks, we have to have real energy. We have to have solid energy, but we don't have that today. We have a power grid in the state of Indiana that's under attack right now from all these green energy activists. No, we need to have real power. Once again, I want to close with my father's favorite Bible verse, Psalm 118, verse 24. This is the day the Lord has made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it. Folks, thanks so much for listening. This is John Rust. I'll see you all again next week on the radio and on podcasts. Be sure to look for me on Spotify, YouTube, iHeartRadio, and on Amazon and Apple Podcasts. This is John Rust signing off. Thank you so much.